Center for Democratic Memory, for having invited me to facilitate this panel discussion. I would like to embrace the initiative to put forward this open discussion, which is absolutely timely. The topic today is the colonial legacy and its impact today. So I would like to introduce all the speakers. This panel discussion is Christopher Columbus and the fight for the narrative. This is a very timely topic, but we move forward, we move backwards rather. We will give the floor first to Stefano Cingolani. I would like to introduce Stefano before his presentation. Stefano Cingolani is a medievalist historian trained in Rome Sapienza University. He's been a researcher, a visiting professor in Catalan literature in UB, as well as in UPF. He also works in collaboration with UOC. He's specialized in Catalan literature as well as in Catalan history from the 10th century to the 14th century. He is the co-author of History of Catalonia by Eumo. He will be speaking about Cristobal Columbus and the pseudo-story of Catalonia. Stefano, you've got 15 minutes ahead for your presentation. Thank you very much. Hello and good afternoon, one and all. It's clear that I'm Italian, but it doesn't mean that I'm an Italian chauvinist. I'm not a defender of Italianity of Christopher Columbus. And at the end of the day, I'm not very much interested in the details regarding the geographic origins of Christopher Columbus. I've never been an admirer of explorers. I should also leave this very clear. The topics that I'm going to be dealing with are pseudo-histories and their consequences. That is a marginal narrative, because at the end of the day, outside Catalonia, this debate is not taking place. But in Catalan environments, this topic has had a certain dissemination, a certain acceptance, and of course all this has had impact, right? So I would like to discuss about how this narrative defines Catalonia's history, or at least attempts to do so, and more importantly, the relationship between Christopher Columbus and the discovery and later conquest of the new continent. So these are the two topics on the table. The first one, what is the real historic theater that the Institute for New History and its founder and spiritual leader, Jordi Belbin, identifies as corresponding to the sailor, Columbus. And I would like to reflect also about how this history matches the general revisitation of Catalan history and also Spanish history, as well as global history that this institute defends. So to start, I would like to say that Jordi Bilben identifies Christopher Columbus with a certain Joan Colom i Bertran, a son of a Catalan family from Barcelona, the 14th century, a wealthy trader family. It should also be said that he's not the first one to put on the table this potential identity, Catalan identity of Christopher Columbus. There's bibliography throughout the 20th century that points at this matter. It should also be said, and I would like to say that this is extremely important, that Christopher Columbus, at least after the 20th century, has become some sort of modern Homer. Everyone tries to find its alternative land, homeland. Of course, many of them are amateur historians and use unreliable data. It's been said that he was from Ibiza, from Mallorca, from Viana. So that would be the son of John II, the king. He's been attributed to Portugal, to Galicia, to many different geographies. Of course, there are several potential Catalan identifications. A couple of pirates claim to be also relatives of Christopher Columbus, and other countries has argued that Christopher Columbus was a Scottish, from Sardinia or even from Greece. Of course, there are doubts, there are big question marks regarding the origin of Christopher Columbus. This is nothing new, right? But at the same time, this is not enough to justify all these long and never-ending list of identifications of Christopher Columbus of the Western Indies, because at the end of the day, he didn't even know that he had discovered America. He never knew that. So what I know regarding Columbus and the theories of the new history theories is the result of a chapter that I co-wrote with Christopher Fornes, a book of history against Catalonia. It was entitled, for an average reader, for a non-expert reader, the argument of Jordi Bilbin, who's written more than a book about Christopher Columbus. He's modified and evolved his ideas. So for a non-expert reader, what he says seems to be proved with documents, with dates, and with historic proofs. But if we double check the internal coherence of Jordi Bilbin's narratives, if we really double check what these documents say, how they are written or how they are interpreted, well, it is clear that there is a high degree of manipulation. The dates are manipulated and the concepts used are manipulated. There's an absolute manipulation, I would say. The traditional technique of the members of the new Nueva Historia Institute is what's called cherry picking. That is, they take a statement, they bring it out of context, and it's then offered as an absolute fact when actually the very next sentence could say the opposite. So this system, this manipulative system, this non-observance of data and facts, this transformation of historic information is a tradition in Mr. Belbe, and also some pseudo-historians who had argued for the Catalan identity of Christopher Columbus. Well, they are declared as sources of inspiration. Enric Mitjana de las Dobles and Cayo Esparellada are good examples of the previous. In summary, it could also be said that Jordi Bilbin's theories and the Nueva Historia Institute theories make us think that Joan Colom y Bertran, after having participated in the civil Catalan War in 1462 to 1472, had been dispossessed of Catalonia. He would have sought refuge in Portugal, then he would have come back a few years after. The exact dates are unclear, but and quite precarious, and they lack coherence, so it's quite difficult to understand when he would have been back to Catalonia using the fake identity of Christopher Columbus. Like if in the 15th century there was an ID card or a passport that imposed citizens an identification. It's not the case. Furthermore, and before discovering the West Indies, he would have married a Portuguese princess who would have brought him the title of Prince of Catalonia, and he would be the hidden father of Erasmus de Rotterdam. And all this is argued, but not proved. It's rather a falsification of a document, a permanent falsification of documents. And one of the bases, one of the pillars of the Nueva Historia Institute is that all narratives from the Catalan myth history and even almost all archive documents, narration, chronicle, narrative, no matter what, would have been censored by the Spanish censorship throughout the 15th century, the 16th century, and even the 17th century. So, in the case of Christopher Columbus, In theory, it would, well, his relationship with the discovery of the new continent would have been hidden, as well as the participation of Catalans and Valencians in the discovery of colonization of the peninsula. Having said that, having said that, I mean, of course, I don't have time to get in detail, but it could be said that all this is a manipulative narrative, an incoherent narrative. What really interests me regarding the discussion that we are having this evening is that according to the authors of Nueva Historia, Bartolomé de las Casas, Francisco Pizarro, and Uthman Cortés would also be Catalan. And if we bring on board these three, the mess of their narrative is endless, because the Nueva Historia Institute considers also, of course, that Catalans are good per se. They are morally superior to Spaniards, and they defend that the first colonization of the Americas by the Catalans and the Valencians would have been much more understanding with indigenous compared to the Spanish invasion of the Americas. So it's clear that this perspective, amongst many other conflicting elements, clashes with the matter of origin of the Black legend that José Luis Villacañas will speak about after myself. If the first conquerors were Catalans and Valencians, and they were much more civilized than the Castilians, why is it possible that another Catalan is at the origin of the Black legend? Is it not contradictory to say that this goes against the traditional understanding according to which the Spaniards behave merciless in the Americas? And here's where one of the conspiranoic theories of the Institute stems from. Why do I say that? Mainly because all the Catalan history has been censored, according to them. The Catalan history has been censored by the Spanish Castilians. The representatives of Nueva Historia consider themselves to be the only ones that have been able of discovering the few well, of course, centuries were good, but not good enough for them not to be able to discover new proofs regarding the original Catalanity of all the history of the Iberian Peninsula since the 10th century all the way to the 16th century. And partially, they would be also responsible for universal and European history. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because according to them, until the 16th century, there was a universal Catalan empire that, according to them, as I will tell you briefly, accepted all the topics, all the history of the Castilian imperialism. An imperialism which is, of course, absolutely criticized and censored because it's the responsible of forgiveness. It's the responsible of one of the most incredible manipulations of universal history. And all this narrative, all this fantasy, all this fictionless fantasy is contradictory on the first hand due to the internal arguments, because of course all proofs might have been falsified, and that means that, well, it's quite intriguing and off-putting, because in their cosmovision, Catalans and afterwards Valencians would be the good ones, would be the ones in charge of reconquest of the Mediterranean empire, discovery of the new continent, etc. And the Spaniards are always described as a primitive people, disorganized, and of course, dependent on Catalonia. What looks or seems incredible is that this race, this superior race, which is the Catalans, which ended up dominating the world, or half of it at least, allowed the Spaniards to steal from them half an empire by the Spaniards, who are always described as incapable of any positive element, both in terms, in political or cultural terms. So how is that possible? How can such a deep forgiveness be justified? Because of course it would seem like Catalans have forgotten about our own glorious history as it's defined by the representatives of the Nueva Historia. Is it the man in black who made us forget about it, or is it some sort of collective Stockholm syndrome, a collective and never-ending Stockholm syndrome? Because according to the fantasies of Nueva Historia Institute, the literature, the golden century literature, was mainly in Catalan and then translated into Spanish and then forgotten. Santa Pere d'Ávila, La Célula de Tormes would be Catalan, El Quijote would also be Catalan because he was from Shishon, according to them, and even it would be the same person as William Shakespeare. You really have to develop a fantastic literature skills to believe that both writers are the same person, El Quijote and Shakespeare. And according to Nuevo Instituto, the Cid, the Reconquer, all these are Catalan milestones, not to speak about James I, who is defined as a liar because both Mallorca and Valencia had already been conquered before him. So, considering that I need to conclude my presentation here, what's really concerning here is that the Nueva Historia Institute, in order to Catalanize universal history, Iberian and universal history, assumes that the Aragonese and the anti-Catalan Aragonese narrative is just fake, as well as all the horrible myths of the Spaniards, not the vision developed by good historians and the vision they have about the medieval times. They consider that all the Spanish myths are Catalan myths, actually, and that they just misappropriated them. And according to them, this would have to contribute to Catalan independence and self-awareness. And as I kind of noted in the book, the Spaniardization of the Catalan history, because this is an Spaniardization, would have loved Minister Bert, who wanted to re-Spanish Catalan boys. There's no better way to do so than accepting Spanish history as it being Catalan history. Perhaps Minister Bert was a donor of the Nueva Historia Institute. Thank you very much, and I hope that my presentation was interesting. Thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you very much, and I would like to give the floor now. Thank you, Stefano, for sticking to the times, and thanks for your narrative. Thanks for the topic. It's been very interesting. I would like to give the floor to Juan Luis Villacañas, who I believe will make a link between this narrative and another perspective. José Luis Villacañas is a professor and an historian of philosophy, as well as the historic concepts and mentalities. He's a professor in philosophy in Universidad Complutense de Madrid. He's the director of the Library for Spanish Thinking, and amongst his last books, we find Imperiophilia and the Catholic Nationalism. His presentation is entitled About the So-Called Spanish Empire, Some Conceptual Precisions. José Luis, the floor is yours, 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you very much. I think I can't screen the video. Oh, there we go. The camera, I meant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for thanks to the European Institute for Democratic Memory. My presentation is very much related with Stefano's presentation. By the way, I would like to warmly greet Stefano because, well, I recall him, I remember him with a lot of affection because we used to study together James I, Jaume I. I believe that it's very important to clarify something here. To a certain extent, Spain never had what we could define as an empire. Spain had an amazing power, but they never ruled an empire because for you to have an empire, you need a formal constitution, very specific constitution based on a substantive base, which would be the ruling of the Supreme Court, the capacity to develop a pseudo parliamentary regime, and more specifically, an empire requires of a federation. A federation that includes a certain division of powers. That means that the supreme judge controlling the currency and the army would not be the supreme legislator. And for many years during the medieval times, probably from Jaume I onwards, and for a while, the Hispanic powers have had an important aspiration to relate to the empire in the European sense of the word. And this was the meaning of the support Spain gave to the Americas invasion and the invasion of Sicily, as well as Alfonso X, who, well, it's very important to make a clear difference here because there's this imperial projection that many Hispanic powers have had, both the Aragon crown and the Castilian crown, with what we call today the Atlantic expansion. Because the empire, in its medieval sense, in its clear institutional sense, placed at the center the defense of Islam, the conquest of Jerusalem, and the possession of the Mediterranean. One could speak about an empire only when we have these elements. And empires have oftentimes been centered in the Mediterranean. The Atlantic expansion, which ended up benefiting the Spanish and Portuguese power, has other reasons of being. And clearly, it has no possible projection that could be considered an imperial projection, because at the end of the day, it was about finding an alternative pathway for all the trade that had been blocked by Constantinople. And this Hispanic expansion gave birth to a patrimonial increase, but not an empire, because of course for an empire to be such, they have to be recognized by social groups. What happened in America, what happened with the Atlantic expansion, first in the Canary Islands and then in the rest of America, in relationship with Castilla, is the expansion of a patrimonial power that, in this specific case, could reproduce in a mimetic way the different forms, the different institutional forms that had been established in the Iberian Peninsula, and at the same time that could deploy the mimesis of the different forms in which the peninsula powers, especially those that had been in touch with Islam until the very last moment, well, the ways they deployed during the 15th century. So from this perspective, it's very important to understand that the Spanish expansion was seen and understood as an expansion of the practices of the expansion, both towards the south of Andalusia and towards the north of Africa. And no matter who sees the payroll of those that embarked towards America with the aim to reorganize the recently discovered land, well, one discovers that many of them that are descendants, second generation descendants of the Spaniards that had been up in the north of Africa at the end of Cardenal Cisneros. So at the end of the day, they are the same social class, the small bourgeois, the petit bourgeois, who at the end of the day, what they did as a job was to steal from not discovered lands such as Algiers, Tunis, amongst others. And the most relevant element from my perspective, and the most relevant element from my side, is that we haven't realized that this form of power was very sudden. It happened in a very sudden way. Castilla was not ready for such a big discovery. Castilla did not have the mentality. They were not even looking for it. So it was accepted in a quite reluctant way by the Catholic kings, not in a very glorious manner. And of course, it was, before anything, the field for the expansion of a way of life that was defined by a great historian as a society ready for war. That's what it is about. So petit bourgeois that have no other way of economy than the war economy, and thus once they conclude that it's impossible to invade North Africa, they try to discover other grounds, such as America, to find a job there, to keep invading, to keep dominating, which is, at the end of the day, their job. And this is well known. It's well known that the political design of the Castilian kings and queens, be it the Aragon kings or the Bourbonia kings, but the American politics was led by the Castilian kings and queens. So it can be proved that there is no project, no remotely organized project regarding this domination process. Actually, they took very many, well, they were based on informality, which was related with the traditional saying in Castilla, which is today very frequent in America also, which is obey me, but don't do what I say. Of course, everyone can recite the guidelines approved by Elizabeth the Catholic regarding the way indigenous peoples had to be treated. All this was obeyed, but not fulfilled, and there was no rebellion. I believe that the most important element that one should say regarding this big American power is precisely that the Castilians that embarked towards the Americas brought with them the aspirations, the fundamental aspirations of the Castilians that stayed in the peninsula, and more specifically, the fundamental aspiration for a service-based society. In the medieval times, it was oftentimes said, if you don't have a moro, you don't have gold. And this was applied in a very mimetic way with the indigenous peoples. If you don't have an indigenous on your behalf, you don't have gold. So the way indigenous populations were split, the way slaves were split was the fundamental intrinsic aspiration and not accidental, the intrinsic aspiration of the conquerors in the sense that they aspired to a certain extent to become petit bourgeois, and petit bourgeois, as we all know, are exempt of any form of work, and thus they just look for a job.
de los reyes de Castilla, en tanto que señores.
The essential aspiration of the different kings as lords of Castilla, in fact, in America, with some of the titles that were contested, of course, by many agents, Spanish theologists, and also impugnated by Francisco de Vitoria and by many other type of European theologies, and therefore was something legitimate and under the focus of debate. The main aspiration of these kings was essentially related to something fundamental, and it was not to produce in America a great part of the aristocracy. The official Castilian history tends to consider the Castilian powers since the Catholic kings as powers which were greatly established. And this is a perspective which is not quite fitting within history. King Ferdinand knew a civil war in Andalusia, the death of Isabel the Catholic, which was impugnating its own government. And it was also impugnating its own government because of specific movements of the high nobility in Andalusia. Therefore, the Castilian kings, what they aspire to is not to reproduce great aristocracy in America, but they do not have any system of government which, besides refusing this idea, able to refuse this idea. So they don't receive the news from Cortés. Cortés has become neutralized. He's the only high representative which is considered there, but once he has this role of Marquis of the Valley, he's obliged to live in the peninsula and he's obliged to become a courtesan. Of course, we still have documents in which we can see that Cortés was considered by the indigenous population its own king. He was hailed as one of his kings, and these letters reach the monarchy, and they are afraid, seriously afraid, to really place a crown on Cortés. But the most important thing, the one that I want to highlight, is that the great powers in America do not have structures, they don't have a specific shape, they do not have any real project. And they can only do one thing, and whatever they can do is to bring to the conquistadores as much as they obtain some power in exchange. The most decisive action related to this is that they cannot, unless they have someone important there within the hierarchy system, they cannot control either the whole of the structure of conquistadores, and therefore they are permanently facing a very strange conundrum, because either they have to generate a real hierarchy and category in America, or they have to generate a real anarchy. Anarchy is about to happen just when the new laws of the India 1542 deny the possibility to the people there, the possibility of inheriting the property. When the encomenderos are told that they are public civil servants who have encomiendas according to the king, and therefore they are not lords of slaves, but the only fiscal lord of the indigenous population is the king. At that moment in Mexico, there is a generation of an extraordinary uncertainty producing something very important, and we could call it, they call it the Santa Junta, but in a way this is just a proto-parliamentary reality, because they gather the different bishops, they gather the members of the cachas, there is also a meeting by the chapter, and also the representatives of the municipality, the audience, and all together they organize like a proto-parliament in the capital Tenochtitlan. And from this proto-parliament, it is said they're not going to apply the new laws. That is to say, they're going to disobey the king, mainly with the argument that the king is too far away from his properties and he doesn't have a genuine knowledge of the reality of Mexico. The king then realizes that this proto-parliament is generating a certain capacity of autonomy, and he decides to improvise from one day to another a system of governance, which is a system of governance which is not Castilian. It's a system of governance typical of the Crown of Aragon, which is the system of viceroys. And the system of the Crown of Aragon was practically designed in order to distribute the different responsibilities of the royal family. And here it is delivered almost immediately to one of the sons of the Mendoza family. But it's not by coincidence, because what happens is that the Mendoza family had the monopoly of the governance of Granada, that is to say, the last territory conquered by the monarchy. And therefore, in a mimetic way, due to the need of the government made by these Moriscos, they launch a real capacity of government in other territories towards Mexico. Antonio de Mendoza, he softens the situation, Tauna de Mora, for the application of the new legislation, and he pacifies America, he pacifies Mexico. Where we do not have this immediate system of these viceroys in Peru, there is a civil war de-articulating completely the whole of the Hispanic domination, and it ruins all the possibilities of generating a presence in this part of Tihuantinsurio, of what we know now as the Inca Empire. It is very important to point towards this double variation because it shows how, in reality, the Hispanic monarchy in Central America and South America, it's going to happen after the fact. So it's kind of organizing like a plan B or a provisional solutions according to the problems they encounter. However, it's quite peculiar, and it shows very clearly what is the interest of the crown. And we see a couple of things that happen there that tell us that we are talking about a colony and not an empire. The first issue is the following. The viceroys cannot be criollos, that is to say, they cannot come from the America and they cannot be part of the original population, and they have to govern for very few months in order not to intimate or marry the natural population. So they are preventing a native aristocracy. And the second one is that the viceroys can only happen, there is only two during the first modernity until the 18th century, precisely because they are responsible for the territories with great silver mines, one in Potosí, Peru, and the other one in Potosí, Mexico. And therefore, this proves that the way to build the power there by the Hispanic monarchy somehow is a way of being closely related to the control of raw materials, mainly gold and silver, leaving, no doubt, a wide autonomy in the urban regime. That's very important to highlight, and giving some importance and autonomy to this urban regime, generating oligarchies, because this regime is extraordinarily stable and loyal to the monarchy, and they lose completely the interest in the construction of the territory, which could maybe generate a future once the monarchy is not longer there. Of course, if to this situation we add that one of the main reasons for the Hispanic monarchy translating its powers to America is the obsession for pure blood. And then we realize that the same structure of the governmental facts in America, in a way, they copy, they mimetize the governing structure that for many years we have had with the Muslims conquered by the Spaniards, and which do not obey to any specific design close to the lands that had been governed and dominated. And therefore, in this sense, we could easily say that Spain had a domination over America, but it had a domination over America without any specific understanding of the problems that those lands had. And I think that this develops this kind of isomorphism so specific of the Hispanic societies and also the Ibero-American societies nowadays, and which they share in a way the same constituent period, which has been dominated by an extremely weak political governance and extremely concentrated in problems of survival more than problems of design and construction. Thank you very much, José Luis, also for not exceeding the time, and thank you for your presentation. We're now going to hear to Cielo Zaidenwerg from the University of Barcelona. If during the first presentation, Stefano was placing us in a place where we want to be an empire, José Luis was telling us that this empire does not exist, but now Cielo is going to place us at the other side of the Atlantic, and all this is celebrated with a specific date, the 12th of October, and in her intervention, it's from celebration to claiming 12th of October a key date in Latin America. So Cielo Zaidenwerg, who is Americanist historian, professor of the Department of History of the University of Barcelona, also collaborative professor of the WOC and member of the research group of Andines. She's also specialist in the history of Argentina, in the process of the creation of the nation state and creation of identity, and author of many publications. Cielo, you have the floor. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you can hear me well. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Thank you, Marta, for the presentation. I was especially happy to participate in this conference because I think this is a moment of reflection which is very important to debate on questions that sometimes don't get out of the academic world. Everybody can on their own mea culpa, but I think we should organize more debates, more historical questioning within our society in general. We will continue questioning these narratives. Having said that, we could say that one of the big question marks for Americanist historians is not only how the commemoration of the 12th of October came to light as a day of reflection, but how this change did not happen before. And the most important thing is how to emphasize the vindication aspect of this day in order not to produce the reading where these indigenous communities are not at the heart of this process. What is clear is that there were several historical facts that were very important in the American continent, and of course this generated an important change of perception around this celebration. In some countries, the American continent, for example, the magical date of the 500 years, 1992, has allowed in a way to crystallize in part of the population the Amerindian historical claims, generating through this symbol of this celebration a symbol of common belonging with the rest of the region. Although it will not be interesting to deal with this, and also we won't have time to talk about the context and the genesis and the history of this celebration. Especially we want to talk about the change. So what I want to deal with during my intervention and this framework in which it's still digital, but we are within extra academic environment. I would like to talk about a brief analysis of the political uses of memory through this celebration. And I would like to give you some hints and propose some lines in order to understand this fact and the different consequences in America. There are several geopolitical factors behind the institutionalization of different dates, such as, for example, the national celebration of Latin America, either by decree or by law. Apparently, the initiative was from the government of Irigoyen, 1917. In Argentina, I say apparently because there are different questions about this, but we have not given many identities to these debates. Some of them are pointing to Dominican Republic. Well, it's not very debatable. But the most important thing, as I was saying, is that these geopolitical factors which are behind the institutionalization of this date at the beginning of the 20th century, they had determined, for example, and there were some things behind this celebration of the encounter. How to celebrate, first of all, the construction of wish Ibero-Americanity, at least from a symbolic perspective. On the other hand, the hypothesis that if the region did not join Spain and Portugal, we run the risk of recolonization by the United States. And thirdly, also the geocultural position of the Iberian Peninsula, the bridge between the Western world and the Eastern world, North and South. This symbolic date was introduced in some political arena and also in some media, and the relevance was pointed to as the historical myth of the discovery or the encounter, as many call it. However, as we were approaching 1992, the celebration of the 500 years was seen and was open towards a new global arena of specific debates, but also specifically in 1991, because that year, 1991, one of the authors who have a very interesting work, Charnoni and Fernando de Nogué, they say that it was then in 1991 when we saw the origin of this counter celebration as a political celebration due to local, national, regional, international reasons. So if we institutionalize the 12th of October, that was before celebrating a matrix of culture, language between Spain and Latin America, was given birth to a movement of refusal towards this orchestration, and it took the different Amerindian peoples of the region to become a political hegemonic force. Truth. Therefore, peoples and communities of America organized themselves in order to celebrate the 500 years as a resistance, as it's said by Bengoa, in a space, in an ideal space, in order to hear to those who so far have become silent. Time goes by, and the different indigenous social movements were writing public text and authorizing claims of justice and historical repair. Not only did we see an emergence of a new political subjectivity, but also saw the progressive support by wider sectors of society. So what happened then in the middle of this process? Whether it is true that in Costa Rica in 1994 they started celebrating the 12th of October as the Day of Cultures, alluding to a social and cultural multi-ethnic capacity of the country. The truth is that what happens, well, the rupture, the real rupture in a way, is the wave of leftist governments in Latin America, especially with Evo Morales as the president of Bolivia, as a maximum expression. And they also generalize this questioning, but from the sphere of power. So the name on behalf of this celebration, which was fundamentally the day of the race as a significative celebration, according to Professor Contreras, then it's questioned and they open a process or an intention in order to decolonize language. In Argentina, for example, the government of Cristina Fernandez, they changed the day of the race by the Day of Respect for Cultural Diversity. And in 2004, already, a member of parliament, Alicia Castro, presented the project not for the 12th of October, but for the 13th of October, in order for it to be declared as the day of the popular indigenous resistance, a symbol, because it was the day after to this date. On the other hand, Rafael Correa decree in Ecuador that the day of the race was going to be called the Day of Interculturality and Plurinationality, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, or Chavez in Venezuela, call it the Day of the Indigenous Resistance, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, the Day of the Decolonization. In Peru, they celebrate the Day of Original Peoples and Intercultural Dialogue. Chile, there is a law approved in the year 2000 modifying what it was characterized as the day of the encounter between two worlds, and they declare not the 12th of October, not the 13th of October, but the 11th of October as the day of the claims by original people, so the day before the specific date. I really find it relevant and interesting, this change of celebration, the before and after. Finally, without any Amerindian nuance, in 2009 in Chile, the 12th of October as the day for respect towards cultural diversity. But not the whole of Latin America has joined this claim. In El Salvador, for example, they continue to talk about the day of the race. In the US, they continue to celebrate Columbus Day, although many cities and states are eliminating this celebration and they call it in a name which shows more respect for native peoples. And I'd like to dwell on another question, which I think is very important also in order to understand the change of paradigm of the celebration. And the truth is that before this legislative change, before those decrees and changes of name, and this is why at the beginning I was saying, what do we place at the center? Who is the political actor of the change of paradigm? Between and before this legislative change, before this formal change in the name of the day, the indigenous resistance contest started much before. Precisely in Santiago de Chile, the 12th of October commemoration day was celebrated for the first time in 1991. Therefore, choosing the date celebrates and they chose this day in order to make society aware of the 500 years of conquista and not much more. So to remember this year, 1 year before the date, allow them to create some groups for the preparation of a platform of joint fight against a series of rights from the indigenous people. So they are heating up the engine. In several countries of Latin America, between 1991 and 1992, different committees were created in order to organize the celebration of the 500 years of conquer as a way to make visible the claims of these communities. In parallel to the big celebrations, the encounter, they prepare these celebration of claims and demands and resistance. What I want to make very clear is that before talking from a legislative perspective in the change of name of this celebration of the 12th of October, it was from the decade of the 90s that the ethnic emerged as an unexpected push. The Zapatista movement, with the rise of the Liberation Army from the discourse and the strong cultural accent of the different agreements of peace, the confederations and indigenous peoples in Ecuador and Peru, the intense mobilization of the different organizations Armada and Quechua in Bolivia, and also the presence of Mapuche in Chile, and the media impact of some leaders in different Amazon peoples in Brazil, Ecuador, Guayanas, Venezuela, Peru, Colombia. All this is just a small sample of the importance of this phenomenon, the emergence then of this movement as a political actor happened as a result of the coincidence of multiple factors. So it's not only these 500 years of the shock of civilizations that all of a sudden produce civilizatory awakening, but the continuous resistance for the survival of the indigenous people in the different historical scenarios: conquest, colonization, independence, and republics. So this is what promoted the active decolonization process. So during the first decade of the 21st century, from a legislative point of view, they changed the name, and many left movements, and also with the contribution of different scholars. And this is what caused this research on how do we call that date. But of course, how do we talk about the whole of the process of conquest? So what are the different symbolic claims, but also specific claims in these manifestations which are implemented from the origin until our current days? The Amerindia fight of the Abayalas people with the participation of different parties. They claim the indigenous resistance one year after another, and also the different claims due to the circumstances according to the country and according to the different conditions of these communities. They claim the discrimination of those peoples, and every year they place specific demands in the middle of historical demands, such as the recognition of autonomy and territory of the Amerindian people. And on the other hand, little by little, we have made more visible the situation of these countries that were exterminated by the state, and on a perfect occasion, which was the celebration of the bicentenary, which we still have in the celebration of these bicentennials. And also, let's say, the independence and those states and nation state also as a movement of who is carrying out this leader. One example is what we call, well, I have different colleagues who are naming this in different ways, but the conquest of the desert, where original communities were exterminated in the Republic, the conquest of these lands in order to serve the interests of the capital. This in the territory of Chaco, Paraguay, also with the Amazonia, is taken by these movements as a claim, not only the 500 years of conquer and colonization.
So, in the celebration of this date, October the 12th, many different claims are articulated. There's a denunciation on the conquest, on the expoliation by the European metropolis. There's also a denunciation about the hegemonic stories, the built narrative, one would say, built by the projects of the new republics that reproduced nation states that are exclusive and discriminatory. It's also key to understand the reivindication of today's exploitation conditions, the political and physical violence that indigenous peoples experience when trying to defend their rights and their lands. Now, the violence is not necessarily exerted by nation states, but rather by governments and companies that allow abusive bills and look to the other side when there are claims about the extractivism. I would like to share a few conclusions. The Amerindian cultures share the destiny of pain, but at the same time, a story of resistance, the historical process, which was little by little, which positioned different groups in a common struggle, which started claiming warranties and their own traditions, their own sovereignty, acknowledgement, recognition, as well as political participation. And these ended up being expressed every October the 12th. Since the beginning of the last century, well, the October the 12th was further developed with new concepts, metaphors, and a reinterpretation of historic projects and a reformulation of hegemonical territories. I'd like to end with an idea. October the 12th is a very remarkable date from the past that acquires relevance in today's present, and it encloses the commitment of becoming meaningful for future communities. In the majority of Latin American countries, originary communities as well as many social groups claim the date as an homage to the struggles and a day for reflection. A reflection, this reflection, well, it's not only about what happened 500 years ago, but about reflecting on why the system is still perpetuated and reproduced for certain communities. One could underline that colonization is still alive in language. Many authors have developed this analysis. It prevails in language, in social relationships, and the subordinations that control the continent and that still run. The continent is still run by a social stratification based on the color of the skin and a pattern towards Eurocentrism. And I am sure that this practice of reflection and this placing big question marks on the table is key. This element, this criticism from Latin America, is a way to somehow provide food for thought in Spain and the rest of the world. And I would like to close here. I have said that I was about to conclude 10 times, but now I am really concluding. The expert from Survival International underlined that October the 12th is open to the same rhetoric of winning a war and perpetuating as Spain does by calling it the Day of Hispanity, to deny what happened in reality. She says it would be unthinkable that old empires like the British Empire or the French Empire to celebrate the day of colonization. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Cielo, thanks for sticking to the time. If you agree, we can now turn on all our cameras because there are several questions for the four of us. And this will be a way to perhaps make it more fluent, make it more fun, one would say. Someone has disappeared. Stefano, are you there? While listening to your presentation and while listening to José Luis' presentation, I am the director of the Casa América Catalunya, and we say that the house is an Americanist house, and it was born at a time when we claim Americanism and not Hispanism, right? So at a time when colonies are lost, we need to start facing America face to face and not from a vertical perspective, right? Which is more the Hispanic approach. But still, when I travel around the world, I kind of feel like I need to apologize for being Spanish. And I always have the same answer. I keep saying perhaps it was your grandparents, or because my grandparents are still here in Spain. So there is a whole hybridation in America, which is sometimes not fine-tuned enough in today's narrative. And I believe this is extremely fascinating. Marta, my apologies. My name is Ricard. Stefano is sharing his screen, and now we can see his very nice picture. I don't know what I did. Stop sharing screen. I don't know exactly what you have to do, but we are seeing your fantastic picture here in the back of your screen. How can I undo what I did? Yeah, there is a little, well, we're going to let him do that, and then we will resume the interpretation service.
En teoria, pots deixar de compartir.
Hi ha
Sí?
una nova
Bueno.
funció.
A veure, faig aquí jo una ràpidament amb una imatge que no té res a veure i així ja està.
Vale.
Una publicitat.
Vale, perfecte.
Apologies for the advertisement. So, once I had a discussion with Delorio, and he used to tell me that he would tell their students, oh, let's speak in Nahuatl. Let's all speak in Nahuatl. And I was reflecting also about, well, last week I met with the theater group that works on the topic of memory, the indigenous memory, the Amerindian memory. And this group used to tell me that for them, text is a colonial imposition. So when they do theater, they don't use a text because text per se is a colonial imposition. So it's quite fun as a concept, isn't it? When you dig in, when you start discussing about these topics, I mean, you really need to dig in to understand things profoundly. So I have a question for you, and there are many in the line, in the pipeline. The Mexican president asks Spain to apologize. Do you think that that's the way to go? Do you think 500 years after a country should apologize for what happened 500 years ago? Do you think this is the way to go? What do you think about this request from the Mexican president? Who should answer, sorry. I think that it's absolutely stupid to ask for forgiveness. That's what Italy does oftentimes. What I think would be timely is to have a critical understanding. As Cielo said, what are we doing speaking about the Hispanic today? Today's Spaniards are not responsible for what Philip II did. But of course, as José Luís said before, there is a certain perpetuation of colonialism here in Spain. And this needs to be stopped. So we need an awareness-raising process, not so much claim for forgiveness. We should see what are we doing today in the present and for who we are working. That's key. That is for sure. Can I speak? I would like to insist on this point because once in the process, in the normalization process in South Africa, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu was asked whether he, as a religious man, was not inclined to offer forgiveness to those that had deployed apartheid. And he said, yes, I'm actually inclined to offer my forgiveness to those that perpetuated apartheid. But first, I want to know the truth. And I believe that what really interpels us as citizens is to be committed, to be seriously committed towards truth and looking for truth in a cooperative way with the other side of the coin, with the other side of truth, and not only with what Spaniards did here or there. It's about finding the whole truth in an open debate, which is extremely delicate, because of course we'll end up listening to painful and difficult things. So it's all about having a holistic perspective about truth, isn't it? Secondly, I believe that there's something very important here, and that is that we need to understand the logics of the Spanish powers, which is a very peculiar logic, I would say, consisting on the weaker, the better. The weaker they are, the greater our actions look. October the 12th was celebrated for the first time in Spain in 1892. 1892 was a year when the most horrific battles had taken place in Cuba, and Cuba was almost lost. Nonetheless, Madrid-based powers organized a march that crossed all Madrid from north to south, from east to west, crowded with people dressed up in Indians or their interpretation of what being indigenous meant. So compensating what's about to happen and happened 6 years after with an apology is stupid. So this whole apparatus, which at the end of the day, it's nothing more than a cover. It's a cover-up to cover the final defeat of the Spanish sub-empire. So it's very important to ensure that October the 12th, well, the Criollo elites were absolutely pro-Spanish. And in Spain, it has a very, the meaning of October 12th in Spain is to cover our own shame, whereas the Criollo elites legitimate themselves thanks to October the 12th. And they end up ruling on indigenous minorities which are not capable of following the process. So it's very important to understand that isometry, that is, the fact that in Spain there are social classes that are extremely related to this historic narrative, and this reality is reproduced in America. And in Spain there are popular classes that have turned the back to this narrative, and of course they have suffered this simultaneously, as well as indigenous had to suffer the Criollo powers. We should never forget the third African reality, which is also a very important reality to understand the situation in America, and we shall also acknowledge this, right? This is an exaltation of the indigenous souls. Well, Africa was already a constitutive element before America, because the main business of the African expansion and the northwest coast was slavery. And this was, of course, implemented by the Portuguese and the Castilians even before Africa was known. Africa is the base of Europe, and America is also a base for Europe. And probably these claims are still forgotten, aren't they? Absolutely. The original peoples are much more legitimized than African inheritance that are not originally from America, but that have been there for many generations now. Absolutely. And perhaps we could not interpret this in a naive way, right? We should not place it out of context. The elites, well, now the elites are not criollo, but of course they belong to other power structures, and they manipulate the narrative when the elections come, etc., etc. So this is a fact. But as you said, Marta, what historic moment are we experiencing, and what shall we do with this hot potato burning our hands? Shall we say sorry? Shall we do a harakiri? Nobody knows. But now, as Stefano and José Luis were mentioning before, of course, we need to be aware at least about who we are. And this is a very interesting anecdote, I would say, very interesting. A few years ago, I was invited to speak by an NGO that organized trips to the Amazons to help the local communities, etc. So these people would travel to the Amazons. As you might remember, this form of holidays was very trendy a few years ago. And it was, I mean, it was very interesting. After the presentation, when I looked at the audience, they were all looking at me like that. They were all staring at me like, really? Did we? Did we do that? Like, as? That's quite striking, isn't it? What do you mean, as? It wasn't you, your ancestors. They were absolutely touched. So the only possible feedback that I could give them was, well, I don't know if it's time to be scandalized anymore. In any case, for me, the only solution here is we need to understand the reality, raise awareness, and from there on, as you said, Marta, stop looking others in a hierarchic way based on continents and societies, and we should look at each other at the face, as José Luis says, because this is what can bring us closer. And of course, I have some more questions from the audience.
Hay una para
There's
Stefano.
one question for Stefano. So the hot potato. There are two questions for me. And the first one is, do you think that Bill Gates lies, or do they really believe what they say? Let me ask you the second question. I've seen the questions, but perhaps you can read them loud anyway. How is it possible that the theories slash crazy things, this is, the crazy things said by Instituto Nueva Historia are so widely accepted by many members of society? Well, at the beginning, Jordi Bilbel probably believed his own narrative when he wrote that, but now that we have digged in, I think that they are lying, and they know they are lying. It's a direct manipulation, I have no doubt about it. Of course, I've been arguing with them via Facebook and Twitter and other means, and there are some people who defend their narrative even if they are not part of the institute. So it's pretty interesting. The defense, and this brings me to answer to the second question, the defense they do is that there is an acceptance, a general acceptance at a certain level, right? There's a certain acceptance of freedom, of the fact that academia is patronizing and impedes new interpretations corresponding to what Instituto Nueva Historia says. Censorship and the fact that, well, they are considered traitors. Now, the main public acceptance comes from this idea that many people accept conspiranoic theories. So probably it comes from a certain frustration regarding the lack of independence, regarding the ignorance. At the end of the day here, what we have is ignorance about the history of the country, the medieval history and Urvid, for several reasons, right? Because it hasn't been really studied. So claiming our grandiosity has ended up, has brought us to accept stories, right? These crazy stories. Now, when it comes to the institutional recognition, to the institutional support, in part, this is possible because, well, they have links, right? Some members of the institute have links with Catalan institutions, so they have been able to somehow invade the public TV in Catalonia, and they have important connections with the Catalan National Assembly, so they have had the possibility to have an impact at the local level and at the municipal level. But the base of the whole thing is ignorance. Unfortunately, the fact that there is no knowledge transmission, scientific knowledge, I'm speaking about scientific knowledge here. And as a result of that, theories like this, but the world is, full with crazy theories, historic theories, and this is the reason why they evolve. And of course, it's a matter of lack of knowledge, absolutely. When you listen to José Luis, it's not like they look forward to accept this history or to gain ownership about it, right? If they really were aware of the real narrative, no one would really like to gain ownership on colonialism. Of course, there is a clear lack of knowledge about the consequences of what one is accepting. Marta, can I speak? Sure. I think that one of the main specific symptoms of the culture that we have gone through, well, I would even say that almost all peninsular peoples, probably not Portugal, but here in the Iberian Peninsula, there are clear symptoms about the major problem we have regarding our own history. And this is nothing new. At the end of the day, it's all about the culture that we've been raised in. Our culture stems from a Catholic world, and the Catholic world consider it suburbious to write about mankind history. But at the end of the day, it's been very useful to make sure that history is kept as a secret of state. And this is very clear in Mariana. Mariana, at the end of the 16th century, writes the only history of Spain that will be alive until my childhood. But the history of Spain ends with Johann II, the Castilian Juan, because Mariana, 1 century after, could not write about Fernando the Catholic, and this is a clear testimony of the fact that the Hispanic powers, I would dare saying even that after Martí I, the Humane, who wanted to make history of the present, there has been a clear lack of willingness to build history or to express the power expression in history. So this has allowed this phantasmagoric dimension of history for many of our citizens in our countries. And I believe that this is what gives history this heterogeneous character, because when you have a tradition, not like you can build up anything or invent anything, but if you don't have a tradition, you can say no matter what, with no coercion, with no limitation, and making others believe that the past is just a smoke and can be shaped depending on your preferences. And I believe that this is extremely related with a deep feeling of illegitimacy of the Hispanic powers throughout times. And I also believe that this is what blocks them when it comes to being transparent and organized their experience. The last anecdote I would like to share. When the Spanish history of Menendez Vidal was published, it's one of the theoretically good history books, Menendez Vidal met the minister in 1945, approximately. I can't remember which minister it was. I think it was Ibáñez. And he told the minister, listen, we're going to get all the way to the 12th century, and we need to count with the most important historian on the 12th century, Sanchez Albornoz. And Menendez Vidal told him, what are you speaking about? It's impossible. We cannot count with the president of the republic, the exiled president. And Menendez Vidal was upset and told him, Minister, we are going to look ridiculous. The only really prestigious historian is Sanchez Albornoz. What are we going to do if it's not with him? And the minister said, Don Ramon, don't speak to me about prestige. Send one of these boys to Germany, to an institute of the Jesuits, and let him write a PhD. Let's publish it in the newspaper, and there you'll find your prestige. So this lack of shame toward truth, which is totally typical in illegitimate powers, makes that a country today, like Spain, is incapable of understanding its own history and having had to invent its history in a very crazy way. The new history that Stefano speaks about is a big paranoia. That's what the whole thing is about, isn't it? But it's part of this absurd and dynamic world that is imposed on the peoples that have not had a permanent story of their present. Thank you, José Luis. I have a question for Celeste in the channel. For Cielo, sorry. It's for you, Cielo. Are some specific areas, monuments, where commemorations take place in America, where the resistance to the American commemorations take place? Yes. Well, there's one point here which is outstanding. It might sound like irrelevant, which is in which countries this festivity is celebrated as a national bank holiday. Other countries celebrate it, but without declaring it a bank holiday, and others don't. So these resistance, these indigenous resistance days are celebrated in cities, in towns. Of course, there are different intensities in these celebrations, but of course it has to do with cultural celebrations, theater plays, concerts, music, dance, etc. Communities, together with the non-governmental organizations, march, they wear the traditional costumes. There's also food trucks in the street with different sorts of objects from the same communities. In Ecuador, the day is celebrated in the Ichimbia Park, and many of these celebrations, I don't really like the word celebration, it's a commemoration more than a celebration, and one could say that it's channeled by a ministerial organization. The Ministry for the Indigenous Peoples in Venezuela organizes many of these resistance marches in different streets in the center of Caracas in Peru, the Inca pathway is also another form of commemoration. It's another important space where there's a symbolic claim.
En Uruguay, por
And also
ejemplo,
in Uruguay, for example, we see paintings and garments with not only of the streets, but of different institutions. And then we have other countries where they celebrate this day, but it's not a festivity like Colombia and El Salvador, for example. And that's it. Yes, countries that don't celebrate it at all, such as Panama, Brazil, or Cuba. It's quite interesting, but there is this diversity, there are different intensities, and we find often the symbology made by monuments, statutes, etc. But the most important thing here is to pay attention to the movement, not only the statue, which we could do without because we have too many, but we're lacking monuments and movements, sorry. So in a way, this is one of the most relevant things to do. Well, thank you very much, Cielo. I'm being told that we have to close this round table. There is one question, I don't know if very quickly, because they have sent this question 3 times, but if it cannot be answered very quickly, you tell me. What are the specific reasons of the success of the book of Roca Barea in Spain? In a certain way, I have already explained that with the example I have given by Menendez Vidal. I think that the reason for the success of this book is that it was an operation by the state, and we counted on the involvement of very important powers and media, which were with a very strong presence from a political perspective and with a huge deciding factor in the recent history of Spain and similar things. But there's not much mystery from this point of view, given the huge amount of powers that have supported it. Well, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, the 3 speakers. I think that one of them had to leave. Cielo, we have to call it a day. It's been a great pleasure. We continue for hours because we could be talking about this for hours and even days, but I think it's quite pertinent to put this on the table of our debate and to reveal the truth of the truths, at least, and to listen to all the voices and to rewrite history. It's quite difficult, but sometimes it's pertinent to do it. And the importance of the narration also belongs to the 21st century. So thank you very much. Thank you for all your comments and contributions. And thank you for participating in the roundtable. Thank you, all of you. It's been my pleasure. Same thing.
Chao, gracias.
Bé, recordem que la
Let me
segona...
remind you that the second roundtable will start at 6:45. Please, we recommend you to turn off your cameras and your microphones, but don't leave the room, and we will connect again in 15 minutes. Thank you.